Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Bougie Oreo. In honor of Black History Month, I thought the best way to really kick off this channel is to do a series on things we learned during slavery that is holding us back from success. Slavery and its generational impacts on Black America and American society has been a hot topic in the media, culture, and politics, especially in the last several years. And I frequently hear other Black leaders and academics and other speakers say things like, "We're still dealing with the trauma of slavery, and we haven't healed from the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow." The prevailing discussion around this is, what does government or white America need to do to reconcile with its dark past? And while that's an important discussion to have, I want to focus on what does the Black community need to do to heal from this dark history as well. Every psychological trauma that people experience, whether it's purely psychological or whether it's physical with a psychological impact, requires some level of self-healing or therapy. Rape victims, veterans with PTSD, victims of physical or domestic abuse usually require some type of therapy to heal and move forward. And this healing is completely separate from the offender or the abuser facing their justice. And I think the Black community as a collective is no different. I'm not saying that we shouldn't pursue policy to improve the economic standing of Black America. I'm saying we need to do that self-healing in addition to pursuing government policy. So this is the first video in a series to talk about the things we as Black Americans learned in slavery that still impacts us today and is holding us back from being the best version of ourselves on an individual level as well as a collective. As a disclaimer, I am speaking in the general context of American slavery, that period between 1619 and 1865, and its impact on Black American culture. So I won't be including how slavery impacted Africa or other countries and continents. We're just keeping this strictly to American culture and American slavery. I'm also going to be generalizing some of the slavery practices. I do recognize that slavery was different from the 1600s than it was in the 1800s, and it varied from territory to territory within what is now known as the continental U.S. So I will be generalizing the practice as a whole over the period. In this video, I'm going to discuss two topics, and each topic will be broken into three sections. Number one, then, which provides context on the slave practice. Number two, now, how our current situation relates to our ancestors' lives as slaves. And number three, change. What do we need to change about how we live and behave now to move forward? So let's get started and let the unlearning begin. Slaves on the plantation were usually assigned either field work or housework. Usually the slaves that were darker in complexion or newly bought from Africa were assigned to work in the field doing hard labor. They were the field Negroes. They were perceived to be stronger, more fit, and more masculine or beast-like. This goes for the men and the women who were assigned to work on the field. So they were perceived to be better suited for the rigorous back-breaking labor in the field. They were given the cheapest and most basic rations for food and the worst quality clothing. They were given cramped shacks to share and to live in. The slaves that were lighter in complexion or had a more gentle personality, oftentimes they were the illegitimate children of the owners or other whites on the plantation. They were usually assigned to work in the house. And they had more favorable roles, which often came with better quality food since they were allowed to eat the leftovers from the owner's table, better clothes because they were often given the owner's hand-me-downs, and better living quarters. Sometimes they even lived in the plantation house. These roles usually included domestic duties in the house, or in the men's case, they were assigned to be the driver or run errands to other plantations or in town, or they may have been given training in carpentry and other skills. The important thing to point out here is any time when one group is being treated better than another group, there's going to be some type of division. Sometimes there's resentment or even shifts in loyalty between slaves. This benefited the plantation leaders because as long as the slaves were divided, as long as some of the slaves were content with the scraps of comfort they were given from the big house, they would be likely to dissuade the rest of the field slaves from running away or rebelling, and if not that, they would sometimes be trusted to report such misdeeds to their masters. There are two things that I see that came out of this hierarchy. The first being the division that we have amongst ourselves as Black people. While we no longer have owners who assign us to housework or field work, we do have prominent Blacks on the payroll who sow division and gatekeep Blackness based on standards of values and behaviors. While we say Black people are not a monolith, any Black person that goes against the groupthink, speaks proper English, and proposes solutions or ideas outside of the stereotypical expectations of Black Americans is quickly accused of quote-unquote acting white and labeled a house Negro, a coon, an Uncle Tom, a Bedouin, or an Oreo. If they are the house Negroes, then mainstream Black culture associated with the struggle by default becomes the field Negro. And somehow we have glorified the struggle life while shaming those who sow success. We, the Black community, are perpetuating this division amongst ourselves like crabs in a barrel, keeping ourselves from climbing to the top. The second thing that came out of this house slave versus field slave division is colorism. Women with a lighter complexion are perceived to be higher class, more docile and gentle, more suited for domestic life, i.e., better to wife, while dark-skinned women are perceived to be more low class and more suited to the laborious and struggle-based lifestyle. I want to note that during the period of colonialism and the early years of the United States, good wife material was defined as a woman who was a good helpmate, but also worked strictly inside the domestic sphere, inside the homes, and not in the fields. Men with a darker complexion are perceived to be stronger, more fit, sometimes even more violent or aggressive, and have the perception of exuding raw masculinity, while lighter-skinned men are perceived to be weaker or softer. The first item to address is the house versus field division in our culture. So, repeat after me. Black people are not a monolith. We are a group of individuals. I say that because we need to start moving forward by fixing ourselves on an individual level. And to do this, we need to break the mold of typical Black behavior and clean our own houses. I challenge you, when you come across another Black person who has achieved any level of success that you aspire to, be it physical health, financial health, or social standing, instead of attacking their Blackness because they don't fit the mold, instead, ask yourself, what does he do that I'm not doing? What does she do that I don't do? And explore implementing some of those strategies to improve your own life. Harriet Tubman had to attain her own freedom before she could go and help other slaves do the same. We have to get our own houses in order before we can fix the entire community, and sometimes that means facing some of the ugly truths that we've gotten accustomed to ignoring. The second item is with colorism. One of the key arguments when the colorism discussion is brought up is some people often explain it to be a preference. It's not discrimination, it's just my preference. While everyone is entitled to have their preference, I first challenge everyone to ask yourself if your preference is only related to appearance, or do you associate certain attributes to people based solely on their complexion? Do you prefer women with a lighter skin tone because you think or may have experienced dark-skinned women are aggressive, hard, rude, etc.? Do you prefer dark-skinned Black men because you think dark-skinned men are more masculine or tougher than light-skinned men? If it is the latter, you are applying the same bias that racist people often apply to Black people by making assumptions about their character or value of that person based on their race. And you as a Black American are perpetuating a system of white supremacy within your own psychology. If this is the case, you as an individual have to make the decision to do something about your perceptions. The second thing that we need to do on an individual level is evaluate ourselves and behavior and ask yourself, is your behavior perpetuating some of the negative attributes assigned to your gender, race, or complexion? As a dark-skinned woman, I know that other people, even within my race, will perceive me to be combative, aggressive, rude, low class, etc. without even knowing me. It's not fair, but that's the reality. And the only way that is going to change is if I defy that narrative by not fighting or being argumentative, by being polite and treating myself and others with respect. That doesn't mean I'm a doormat when I'm being mistreated, But it does mean that on a regular day-to-day interactions, I am striving to put my best foot forward so you have a more positive perception of me than negative. The same process has to take place for all other groups. I'm not telling you how to behave. I am stating the situation and what we can do on an individual level to change perception, absent government policy or nationwide culture change. The only way to get rid of stereotypes is if there are more of us who defy the narrative than those who confirm it, and that goes beyond colorism. The second topic for this video that I'd like to talk about is unstable family structures. So during slavery, marriage was illegal for slaves as they were considered property, and property cannot enter into contracts like marriage. In some states or territories, the owners could permit the slaves to marry. However, this was a marriage in name only, and it was only really allowed for the purposes of preventing slaves from running away and creating more slaves. When the slave trade from Africa was banned, the only way to sustain the labor force was to birth the next generation of slaves. Black children were born for one of three reasons. Slaves formed consensual relationships and had children, or Black women became pregnant after forced intercourse with the slave owner or other white plantation workers, or Black women were forced to have sex with other male slaves for the purposes of bearing children. Matter of fact, slave breeding became big business in the South after the slave trade was banned. After the children were born, the brunt of the work in raising the children fell onto the mother. Under the best circumstances, when the mother and father had a quasi-marriage on the plantation, the parents still had to return to work on the fields or in the house. However, the mother may have been allowed to take brief breaks to take care of the child, or had to carry the child while working if there wasn't someone older on the plantation who would take care of the children while the mother worked. And there was always the risk that the family would be separated by the owner selling either the mother or the father. If the child was born from forced relations with the owner or other plantation workers, the child was illegitimate and had no familial relationships with the father. And if the child came from the forced impregnation from another slave, there was also no familial relationship. So on the plantation, the stability of a family unit either didn't exist or it was extremely volatile. And the mother was often in the role of a single mother, having to rear the children alone while still having to work and grind on the plantation. And Black men, even if they wanted to, didn't have the ability to be a father, protect his family, and provide stability in the way that free families were able to. Following the abolition of slavery in 1865, Black Americans did begin to practice marriage and form nuclear families. In 1890, 80% of Black households were two-parent households. But starting around the 1950s, that started to decline to the point where it is today, which is around 20 to 30% of Black households being two-parent households. Now, there are a number of factors that contributed to this, including the Great Migration from the rural South to urban cities in the North, women's rights, and feminism. However, several Black scholars theorize that although divorce rates and unmarried birth rates were significantly higher than their white counterparts in the 1950s and 60s, the passage of the Great Society Act and the establishment of the welfare system caused those pre-existing conditions in the Black culture to explode. Marriage prior to this period was pretty much required for survival, so couples and families could share resources and responsibilities. Not to mention, women couldn't own property and there weren't many career opportunities for women. But establishing the welfare system and opening up the doors for careers for women allowed us to survive alone and use the government programs to supplement for what we didn't have. The problem now is, unlike every other culture and community, it's the norm in Black culture to grow up in a one-parent household. Not only is it the norm, we found a way to take pride in it. And while all these social movements promoting sexuality and cheering on hookup culture and strong mothers without husbands, other cultures are not really doing it to the level that we do it. People who are more conservative or old school would probably argue that people, in particular women, should not have sex until they are married. But if we are realistic about the culture in which we live today, that's just not going to happen on a large enough scale to reverse these negative trends. In my opinion, what is more realistic is to focus our efforts on reducing the pregnancy rate outside of marriage. First comes love, then comes marriage, then comes the baby in the baby carriage. We need to remove the social acceptability and sometimes glorification of single motherhood and baby mama status. In 2021, there is no excuse for getting pregnant because you had consensual sex without some method of contraception. Let's be real here. We all took sex ed in middle school and in high school. If you slept through it, you've seen plenty of commercials and ads. You know what a condom is. You know what birth control is. You know what the morning after pill is. It's time to start using these tools. If we are grown enough to do the naughty, we should be grown enough to handle our business and do what is needed to be done to not get caught. And I'm putting this on men and women. The new mantra needs to be no wedding, no womb. If he loves you enough to want to have a baby with you, he should love you enough to marry you. So let's normalize and glorify marriage before children. All of us can agree it is easier to raise children with two parents. And by two parents, I mean two active and engaged parents instead of one. It's easier to maintain a home with two incomes instead of one. And even if one of the parents doesn't work, it's easier to divide the household and family responsibilities between two people instead of one. Yes, you can do it with one parent, and there are some great single mothers and single fathers out there. But I believe if you are honest with yourself, you will admit that it is easier to do everything when you have some help and when you have that partner to help you divide those responsibilities and share those burdens. So let's normalize healthy marriages before children. That's all I have to say for this video. Let me know what you think in the comments section and stay tuned for the next video. Feel free to hit the like button and subscribe.